Michael.
What are the towels?
Towels, just in case you want to take a shower during the podcast. It's an extra feature in order to make our guests feel welcome.
Well, we'll keep it clean. We won't need a shower.
Michael Pollan. Wow. Welcome.
Thank you, Jason. Very good to be here.
Thanks for coming on. I got to say, I've been a fan for many, many years, and it's just an absolute privilege to be here with you. And I just salute you for your work in the world, for your words,
thanks.
for your writing.
Don't embarrass me.
Oh, I just, that's how we soften our guests up. So you've had quite a year.
Yeah, I didn't expect to be spending an entire year talking about psychedelics all over the world.
That's right.
My expectations for this book were pretty modest. I mean, I didn't know that people wanted to read a book about psychedelics.
Did you have an inclination, though, that this was going to resonate? Because, I read your New Yorker article a few years ago, the trip treatment.
Yeah.
And that really jolted me because I thought, wow, okay, so here is a rigorous and sober account of the ways in which psychedelics can offer pathways to transformation and healing without becoming an inflated, self-righteous piece full of spiritual ego saying, I went to God just to see and I was looking at me, you know what I mean? And I was just like, I was marveled at that. I mean, you introduced some key ideas, so that must have told you.
Yeah, the response to that article was very heartening, and it's why I got to write the book.
Yeah.
I mean, I was able to show that to my editor, and she
Yeah.
was like, "Yeah, let's do something."
Yeah.
And that article was very much a straight piece of science journalism. It was all white coats and no first person,
Right.
And because I don't know that I could have gotten the New Yorker to publish that many words on psychedelics if it weren't science journalism.
Sure.
So it did open the door to writing about this, but there's this shibboleth in book publishing that drug books don't sell, and I had, I was known to most of my readers as someone who writes about nutrition and food and agriculture, and would they come along? So there was plenty of anxiety around it.
Well, beautiful anxiety though, because it also gave you immense credibility. That you were not necessarily a psychonaut.
Right.
You hadn't drank the Kool-Aid.
I came at it as an outsider. Yeah. I had the journalist skepticism. And then I had the personal nervousness about the whole thing. I hadn't used psychedelics in a serious way until I was in my late 50s.
Right.
So I think that made it an easier path for people to go along with me, because I wasn't. Most books about psychedelics have been written from inside the tent.
That's right.
And
inside baseball.
Yeah, and they're for people who are already convinced of their value, who have already had the experience or a lot of experience. Yeah. So mine was kind of a primer for people outside.
Right.
And
now, do you find that people who have read How to Change Your Mind and have been inspired by it, how many of those people were aware that in a previous book, The Botany of Desire, you wrote a lot about cannabis, which is another healing psychoactive plant, now having in a completely legal framework in California and other states, being used for all kinds of healing modalities and having an economic boom, and yet very little has been written about the first person subjective effects of cannabis outside of the strictly medical model. Like, why would a high functioning, creative, intellectual benefit from cannabis? Like, there's been very little writing about what is it about cannabis. And yet in Botany of Desire, I felt you had put out there the most eloquent account of cannabis phenomenology I had come across. And as somebody who has enjoyed delicious reveries on the back of cannabis, I am somebody that needs to tile experiences in language. Like, that's how I make sense of my own thoughts, by putting things into
Me too.
words.
I can't think without writing.
Exactly.
I'm useless.
Well, I can't think without speaking, so there you go. But you specifically had written so eloquently about cannabis, and so I would have thought that already that prepared you for writing How to Change Your Mind in terms of the first person account, because
it
wrote
teed
about
it up.
Yeah.
It teed it up in that I I had such pleasure writing that chapter and thinking that way, and thinking about how we change consciousness and why we change why is it adaptive to change consciousness? It would seem to be maladaptive, right? From a strictly Darwinian point of view, you're putting yourself in jeopardy. You're vulnerable. You're discombobulated. You know, the lion could come get you, and you would think it was an apparition.
Right.
And,
That's right.
And so
But your theory was that it led to mutations in thought.
Yeah, it had a very important role, and I think this is true of psychedelics too. I call it a mutagen, what did I call it? A meme. It's a mutagen for memes. Okay, we have mutagens for genes. Various environmental influences, solar radiation, for example, that mutate genes, lead to mutations that, in some cases, end up advantaging the species. Right.
Right.
The same thing happens in cultural evolution. You have these kind of weird new takes on things.
Yeah.
Most of them are bullshit, they're nonsensical, but every now and then one of them turns out to be really valuable, and it totally sends evolution on a new course. And
That's right. I mean, you could say that the entire history of Western philosophy from the time of Plato was mediated by his own experiences when they would have their Eleusinian mysteries.
Yeah,
so.
It may be. I mean, it's amazing how many people in Greek society participated in these rites, and it appears, we don't know for certain, that there was a psychedelic involved, possibly derived from ergot, which is
it's a fungi, right? Yeah,
it's the fungi that is the basis of LSD. And in fact, there's some new research coming out, I was told about, in the next few months, where they examined residues in some little pots in Greece and found some LSD-like compounds. So we may well find that, along the way, drug experience has affected evolution, cultural evolution.
Yeah.
Now, Terence McKenna said it affected biological evolution too.
Sure.
The stoned ape theory, which I am not convinced by it.
Yeah.
I find it,
although it is compelling.
It's compelling, but I think fanciful. The piece that's missing is how does this enter the genome? I get how it enters the cultural history.
Well, the same way that trauma enters the genome, right? I mean, don't they say that you can inherit trauma in the nervous system? So maybe the inverse is also true.
Epigenetics. You're talking about epigenetics.
Yeah, sure.
It's possible. It's possible.
I mean, I remember reading this quote once that said, "Our cells are a technology that turns experience into biology," and that was an epigenetic piece. And so, if that stuff can eventually, if your experiences become seated in the organism, essentially, right, you become the sum of your experiences, or you become what you behold. And certainly, what you behold during a profound altered state of consciousness can have all kinds of repercussions for the rest of your life and the decisions that you make and the things that get passed down in culture and so on and so forth.
Well, we've seen it with trauma. We've seen it with starvation. There's certain phenomena that get carried forth, but for a couple generations. I don't know that we've seen them become permanent parts of the genome.
Interesting.
But I think that where there's a lot of potential validity to that is looking at things like religion. You know, that the very idea that there is a beyond or an unseen world of some kind or an afterlife. I mean, where would you get those ideas? I mean, dreams, to some extent, but it seems to me that psychedelic experience could well be the source of those ideas.
Oh, very much so.
And
also the fact that psychedelic-like experiences can emerge without the ingestion of psychoactive agents in certain situations. I mean, you fast for 40 days or certain contemplative practices. It's not difficult to imagine that so many of the visioneering that took place in the past that led to gospel-like pieces of writings was inspired by profoundly altered modes of perception.
Oh yeah, so there are many ways to get there. Psychedelics is they're really a shortcut. You know, I was recently given a light therapy by.
Did it work?
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. And I lie down, and this woman had this device called a I don't remember the name of it. It was invented by some scientists in Austria, and it flashed light, a couple different kinds of light, and I had my eyes closed, listening to music on headphones. And it was amazing how quickly it put me in what felt like a hypnagogic state of consciousness, which is the state right before sleep when you're getting these very brief snatches of narrative and imagery that are very elusive, and it's a very pleasant state of things, although you can't really grab onto things. As it doesn't have as much narrative coherence as psychedelics do.
Okay.
But anyway, within seconds, and I had my eyes closed, and I was seeing these incredible patterns of light that were very kaleidoscopic. And lots of color. And then I asked her, I opened my eyes later and I said, well, what were you seeing when I was seeing that? And she was only seeing white light. And my mind had broken it up into the different pieces of the spectrum. According to what logic, I have no idea.
Sure.
So there are many ways to get to these states of consciousness. I think they're really important in human evolution and human history.
Well,
and there's a reason that as a species we've sought them.
Yeah.
So,
and that is triggering my next thought here. I read a book a couple of years ago. I can't remember the name, but I remember that the basic subject was the biological advantage of being awestruck. And essentially it was saying that these kinds of experiences that hint subjectively at the felt encounter with a beyond, or with the spaces pregnant with cosmological existential meaning, can inform the behavior of the species to do acts of self-sacrifice and altruism, and be guided by the North Star and drape the cosmos with consciousness and set sail in a black ocean before we had satellite communications, and that these divinations can be useful fictions that can then have a biological advantage because they imbue us with a felt experience that we matter and that our lives matter.
And we're willing to sacrifice ourselves.
That's right.
To something larger.
That's right.
Dacher Keltner, who's a mutual friend of ours, studies awe as a psychologist at Berkeley. And, he says that awe is a pro-social emotion because it shrinks the ego. It encourages the small self. And therefore more openness and willingness to cooperate with the group. May well be true, and that may be one of the things it does. Another thing I think it does that's important is essentially, deal with boredom, which is an existential problem, right?
Yes.
For most people, for most of time. I mean, we're less bored than people were probably for most of history because we've invented so many ways to entertain ourselves.
Because back in the day, they were either bored or scared.
Yeah, bored or scared.
Sure.
Or working.
That's why I was excited when I first discovered Csikszentmihalyi's book, Beyond Boredom and Anxiety, because most humans are just oscillating between those two states. Yeah. And I want to read to you one of your own quotes from How to Change Your Mind, which talks about why travel, certain kinds of drugs, and beauty are celebrated for their capacity to move us beyond those oscillations between boredom and anxiety. There's so much of our default.
Well, our default is to develop some really slick algorithms to help us get through experiences. By essentially approaching them as models of previous experiences. And this is like that, so I'm going to react like that.
Right. It saves energy.
It saves energy. It's very efficient.
Right.
I think if we had to reinvent the wheel and deal with fresh experience and a new way to deal with it every single time, it would be exhausting, and we would not get a lot done.
That's right.
So there's a lot of benefit to it. Most of these things are a two-edged sword. It's important to
as
keep
with
in
all
mind.
Tools. Right. You can use fire to cook your food or to burn the village. You can use the alphabet for poetry and for encoding knowledge, or for hate speech propaganda. Yeah. I always say this in my lectures about technology. It's like everything's a double-edged sword. Yeah. Certainly ecstatic technologies are too.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely true. So so that's another use, boredom, distracting us from pain and misery, very, very important things. But I think a lot of it is innovation. I really think that the species or the mind in crisis needs to break out of those algorithms and try something new. And psychedelics frees us from habits of thought, from the way we did it last time. We forget the way we did it last time, or it's blown up. And that's where the novelty enters the picture. I think they're novelty generating machines. Now, most novelty is not necessarily good. I mean, just as mutations in nature don't usually work. Right. But every now and then one works really well. Right.
Throw shit against the wall until something sticks.
Yeah, until something sticks. And psychedelics throw a lot of shit against the wall.
Well, so this is interesting, right? Because, if we go back then to what we're ultimately saying, we're saying that altered states of consciousness or occasional encounters with different ways of being and different ways of seeing are cognitively useful, potentially cognitively beneficial, emotionally beneficial, right? So,
well, healing too. Yeah,
healing.
We've seen that.
Right. So much of so much transformation can happen when we encounter an altered state of consciousness, and these altered states of consciousness can be characterized by profound awe, profound existential cosmological wonder, and we know that awe and wonder are healing. And our friend
Dacher Keltner.
I always mispronounce his name.
Dacher. Well, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, but he's never corrected me.
Yeah. When I came across the studies in awe, I was blown away because the description was very similar to the way a mystical experience on psychedelics is described. So they described awe as an experience of consciousness in which your mental models of the world are so stretched, right? Awe stretches your mental models of the world beyond their normal boundaries or limitations, which brings to mind that line that once a mind is stretched by a new idea, it never returns to its original position, right? You're transcending your cognitive Kansas and you're going to Oz, you're Dorothy, you're Alice down the rabbit hole. But that these experiences that stretch your mental models of the world force you into now accommodating this new experience. And that act of accommodation is what changes you.
Yeah.
Because now the birth of a child, the Grand Canyon, the first time you saw the images of the Hubble Space Telescope. And that act of accommodation, that act of literal expansion of self, it leaves all these positive residual benefits.
Yeah.
Increased well-being, increased compassion, increased creativity. So we know for a fact that the quaking, annihilating glory that McKenna has written about, the obliteration of self caused by an encounter of such profound beauty and cosmological wonder, makes you a nicer, better, kinder, more compassionate person.
Not always.
Well, okay. We can get into that as well.
I argue this point with Dacher all the time. There is another kind of awe. There's the awe that people are feeling at a Trump rally. There's the awe people felt at Nuremberg rallies, in crowds.
Well, it can be manipulated.
In mobs.
That's true.
So I think, again, double-edged sword. We have to keep that in mind.
Very well put. Well,
there's a kind of political awe or a fascistic awe.
That's right.
That we shouldn't lose track of.
Oh, dude, I'm from Venezuela. I saw the awe of Chavez's followers following him straight into oblivion. I've seen how awe, I guess, can be hijacked by politics to lead us into hell.
And the subordination of the self, the ego, to the greater good doesn't have to be the greater good.
Right.
Yeah, it can lead to mob violence too.
That's very true.
So I think we need to keep that in mind. But
that is true. Well, okay, fair enough. We need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, nevertheless.
But
the larger point is true.
Sure.
There's a lot of positive benefits that come out of this kind of experience.
Yeah.
And psychedelics are an awe experience, right? It's a chemically induced experience of awe.
Well, that's right. Well, this is where I was going, is in this relationship between, if we know that awe can be cognitively beneficial, and that the responsible use of certain ecstatic tools like psychedelics can, I guess you could say, democratize access to the sacred, potentially taking it out of institutions like traditional religions that we may be disillusioned with or feel that they have been corrupted because they have used awe to lead us to hate the other or to judge the other. That now every individual can see and have his own experience of awe and wonder, potentially, because these tools.
Unmediated, by an institution. That's
unmediated by an institution, but mediated by a tool.
Right.
The tool offers the portal or the gateway.
Right.
And so do you think that then the renaissance of psychedelics or the legalization of cannabis then has created a world where we have increased, in David Lenson's line, a potential for increased stewardship of internal life and stewardship of altered states of consciousness like experiences, which can give us more regular access to these modes of mind and meaning that seem to be so healing?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's a tool that we're putting people in, it's still illegal, we have to remember, not in the case of cannabis, but in the case of psychedelics. But it is making these kind of experiences available to more people. It's still not, I mean, it's democratized to an extent. I mean, it's striking how white and affluent the psychedelic community is.
Yeah, I've read a lot about that.
And so we have to keep that in mind. But it is putting it is circumventing the institutions that mediate certainly spiritual awe. And that, of course, has been threatening to them over the years, right? I mean, we saw this when the conquistadors got to Mexico, and people had these mushroom ceremonies, and they were having these ecstatic experiences that the Spanish watched, and then realized when they heard that the indigenous peoples called their mushrooms Teonatocatl, which meant flesh of the gods. Which is, of course, exactly what the Catholic Eucharist was, eating the flesh of the gods.
They were like, no.
No, we have that monopoly. You're not going to challenge that. And we've seen this. The Reformation was all about people wanting unmediated contact with the divine. Right. So far, there hasn't been a backlash on that order, but stay tuned.
I imagine you read the Life magazine article by Gordon Wasson. He was the first Westerner that went and took mushrooms with Maria Sabina.
Yeah,
dude, I'll never forget that line where he described the experience. He said he spent the evening uttering ejaculations of amazement.
It's your kind of sentence.
Totally. I'm like, it's so funny. I've done videos where I was talking about ejaculations of amazement, or extaculations, as I was calling them, and I got made fun of so much. But it's so true. Okay, so this is the question. I spent a lot of time trying to find the language, or just, I guess, enjoying putting words to these reveries, these healing reveries, because I do not subscribe to any traditional religion, but I would be lying if I said that I don't have a religious life, in the sense that I choose to believe that that life matters, and that we aren't insignificant, and that agency and free will and our capacity to engender creative things in the world is meaningful.
Right.
And so that's a leap of faith that I'm ultimately taking. I mean, we're also a speck of dust suspended in a sunbeam.
Yeah, look, sacred, to say something is sacred is basically an extreme statement. It has a lot of meaning, right?
Yes.
It's imbued with meaning.
Correct.
Right. And that's fundamentally a religious idea.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, when I try to describe for people the phenomenology or the subjective experience of an altered state of consciousness that is healing, like, people will say, well, why? Like, why is it healing? Like, is it like being drunk? And it's like, well, no, it's not like being drunk. It's just different than, and you wrote about this in the beginning of How to Change Your Mind. You said that and I'm paraphrasing, correct me if I get it wrong, but you said that the human brain, like, the human brain works like an artificial intelligence system. We take in data from the present, we compare it with data from the past, and we use that to make inferences about the future. So the brain is a prediction machine, and those algorithms get set in stone by the time we're adults. And so our default is a kind of future tense with a low-level hum of anxiety.
Right.
And then I chuckled. You were like, the good news is I'm seldom surprised, but the bad news is I'm seldom surprised. I was like, so that's the default, right? That's 21st century normal. That's Jamie Wheel's like fibrillating anxiousness, and exacerbated by social media and attempting to multitask and not getting enough sleep, and the anxiety of not having meaning in our lives because we have dead-end jobs that we hate, or we're not living our passion, or whatever it may be. The amount of people committing suicide now being more than the amount of people that die from armed conflict and natural disasters combined. The epidemic of depression, like all this mental health stuff that's happening, it seems to be precisely because people are, there's like a kind of like overactive, future-focused, anxious state. The whole Robin Carhart Harris entropic brain theory, the default mode network. The ego is like metastasized into an oppressive. Like, we're all walking around like oppressing ourselves, essentially.
In effect, I mean, basically, we have overactive egos,
right?
And egos can be very punishing, and the algorithms get too rigid. and they worked under some circumstance, but over time they're no longer working. The environment's changed, the needs have changed, but we're stuck here.
Stuck in these
and
loops.
And we all have this experience of having certain narratives we play over and over. We know now where in the brain that happens and why it happens.
That's right.
But they're very hard to escape.
Right.
And one of the things that really struck me in my research about mental health, which is a big part of what the book is about, is that all these disorders of mind, including depression, anxiety, obsession, eating disorders, may all be the same thing, more or less, which is to say being trapped in destructive narratives,
That's right.
habits of thought that no longer serve the organism very well.
Yeah. And that you can't move past them. You can't step outside of them.
You cannot get the perspective. You can't lift yourself far enough outside of yourself to see that it is just a narrative and it's inaccurate. That narrative that says you can't get through the day without a drink or a cigarette, or that you're unworthy of love.
You're stuck in a loop. And this was very interesting. It reminds me of that article that I shared with you by Chris Letheby about how psychedelics violate our expectations about self and world. So we've been talking about how we have these algorithms that create these, because the brain is a prediction machine. So these algorithms of expectation can metastasize into like a depressed person always expects everything to be depressing.
Right.
An anxious
person.
And
then it becomes.
Exactly. Because it's also that feedback loop that you become what you expect.
Yeah.
And an anxious person always expects everything to be anxious. And you're stuck in these loops and you can't get out of them without
some kind of bad predictions, essentially.
That's right. That you're stuck in.
Yeah.
And so what they say in that article is, and they were talking about the epistemic value of psychedelics, whether or not the contents of the experience were true empirically, like you met God or you saw the afterlife, that matters not. The epistemic value is that people who have an experience that essentially violates their expectations, right, is an experience that is beyond mere description. Because you can tell a depressed person, there's another way to see the world. If you just go stand over there. No, literally, I could put you on a plane. We could go to South Africa. You could see elephants and you could forget about your problems. Like literally. But that's just knowledge by description. That doesn't get through. They talk about, instead, what psychedelics can provide is an experience of knowledge by acquaintance.
Yeah.
And the knowledge by acquaintance is you pick the person up and you put them somewhere else and now they're seeing the world. Yes.
It's knowledge by experience.
That's right.
Yeah. And that's the thing that some scientists have trouble getting their head around. When you're giving a patient a psychedelic, you're not giving a drug.
That's right.
You're giving an experience.
That's right.
And in the same way trauma can be transformative in the negative.
That's right.
You can have a quantum change from a positive experience.
Yes.
Plus, you also have this other kind of experience, which is the new perspective.
That's right.
Many of the patients described to me, I felt like the camera was pulled back further than it's ever been.
Sure.
And I could see myself.
Beautiful.
And I realized how stupid it was to smoke a cigarette.
Right.
And, these were not profound ideas. In fact, they're banal ideas.
Yeah.
But they acquired a certain authority.
Because you were experiencing them afreshly.
Yeah, and
that's the difference.
And you felt it. It wasn't.
Right.
There's no split between idea and feeling.
That's right.
And that
you become what you behold. It's a mechanism.
You do. Do.
That's right. Well, Roland Griffiths from Johns Hopkins, he coined the term inverse PTSD, which I think was in your New Yorker article, and that resonated a lot because it's like, well, exactly. If trauma, right, is this undigested thing, right? The body keeps the score. It's a profound experience that changed your predictions, right? Because now everything is potentially more about trauma. Yeah. Right. And David Lenson talks about this too. He says expectations become negatively prefigured. Mm-hmm. So anxiety becomes a kind of temporal dislocation. The past trauma is now it has changed your lenses of perception, and it's over-determining the present. So it's misperceiving what's happening now and conjuring up a future that becomes identified with death or doom or whatever it is you fear. And so it's this temporal dislocation. And so what is needed is another experience, equally powerful, obliterating, quaking, annihilating glory, becoming one with the Bach music that would happen to you, and that can literally allow you to finally digest and let go of the trauma, right? To move beyond your lenses of perception, those lenses of prediction, right? Because we see with our lenses and we see through our lenses, but we don't always see the lenses themselves.
That's right.
That's the other thing that Chris Letheby had written, that these psychedelic experiences make you aware of your own lenses. So it's like that zooming out that we're talking about allows you to see the way in which you were seeing the world.
That's right.
That
it was a way.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's 100% true.
Yeah.
So we know that this can be healing. But back to the finding the words to describe these experiences from the inside, and back to the beginning of how to change your mind. So we're talking about this future-focused, low-level anxiety. Bad news or good news is I'm seldom surprised, so I'm always prepared for whatever's coming. Nobody's gonna surprise me or sideline me. But the bad news is I'm seldom surprised. There's never any delight. There's never any joy coming around the bend. And then you say, and this is what really struck me, because this is where it gets into like the sense of first sight, unencumbered by knowingness. You said that one of the things that commends travel, which is associated with novelty, which I love, beauty, an encounter with beautiful art, aesthetic arrest, music, and then certain kinds of drugs, where I would put certain psychedelics and cannabis at the right doses, is that these experiences block, these are your words, if I remember correctly, these experiences block all signals forwards and backwards. So they're blocking the whole
prediction and past performance.
That's right. So I'm not comparing this with the past, and I'm not automatically like anticipating what's around the bend. And
I got to deal with what's in front of me.
Yes,
for the first time.
But truly deal with it, right? And when you
see it for what it is, because
right.
Because when we're predicting, we're saying this is enough like that I don't really have to attend to the details.
Story of my life.
And so we don't take it in.
That's right.
We go right to the shorthand.
Right. And so there's no joy. There's no childlike joy.
That's right.
The been there's and seen that's of the adult mind.
Right.
And so again, you go, so by knocking these signals forwards and backwards, you're finally dropped into the flow, another word I love, of the present. The flow of the present. And then you go, the present that is literally wonder-full. Mm-hmm. Wonder being the byproduct of that unencumbered sense of first sight, to which the adult brain has closed itself. Unencumbered sense of first sight is exactly what we're talking about. When you can't compare this with what you've seen before and therefore not engage with it because those signals are knocked offline, because the short-term memory disruption of psychedelics, is draining your pool of sense impressions as quickly as it fills. It's knocking you into these discrete present moments that have no story attached to them, except for the delight of encountering them and beholding them in the moment.
It's the child's consciousness.
That's right.
Yeah, that's where it takes you.
That's
I think
exactly right.
And the child has, at least the young child has unencumbered.
That's right.
Which is to say, ahistorical
sight.
Right.
That's right. And then well, this is where it gets exciting for me. Mm-hmm. So you have childlike perception, but then you have adult sophistication and language. So then it's like, then you're Blake. Then you're seeing the world in a grain of sand, and heaven in a wildflower. You're holding infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Yeah. Sometimes just to recite is to become, especially when you're in those altered states of consciousness and you're in the fully present moment and you've knocked the signals forwards and backwards offline. And then you sort of find the language and you recite the language to describe what's happening. You can get into a really nourishing feedback loop.
Oh, yeah.
Characterized by elation and reverie and gratitude and grace and bliss and awe. And that's what we're talking about.
That is. And you're right about the adult mind bringing it to bear. I think the best example that I've read is Aldous Huxley in Doors of Perception.
Yes.
Title borrowed from Blake.
Yes.
Where he, on mescaline.
Yes.
And this is apparently, I've never tried mescaline, but apparently it's a property of mescaline. Just spends so much time examining, the folds of cloth in his pants, which become incredibly profound, and then lead him to the painting of cloth and Renaissance, artwork, and that ability to take the givens of our lives, the things we don't see anymore, and see meaning and wonder there, is. You have to scrape away so much to get there, but the drugs scrape it away.
1,000%. And I also think that, this is what we're talking about, the regular encounters with this space, because I'm not necessarily saying that we can live in that space all the time, because we also have to fetch water and chop wood, because don't get me wrong, a part of me, the adolescent in me is often like, I want to feel this bliss all the time because I'm so allergic to banality and boredom. And then another one of your lines that stayed with me: what is banality and boredom except techniques the educated mind deploys against experience so that it can get through the day without being continually exhaustingly astonished.
Exactly.
So it's exhausting to be in awe all the time. You got to save it for sacred time. You know, you have Kairos, but then you also have to go Chronos and fetch water and chop wood. You know what I mean? Like,
there's a reason we don't stay in this state our whole lives.
Right.
It's very good. I mean, you know, Alison Gopnik, who I quote in the book, the child psychologist, who really believes that psychedelic experience is the closest version we have to childhood consciousness. The mind of the child is all about exploration, not exploitation. And as you move from explore to exploit, that's adulthood.
That's right.
And exploit is what you need to do to chop the wood and get things done and succeed and pass on your genes and all this kind of stuff that we need to do as a species. But there must be this period also where we're simply exploring. And one of the things psychedelics do is it appears to, and this has been shown in other dimensions of life, reopen those windows that close on us as we get older. There was a very interesting experiment done with MDMA by a neuroscientist named Gul Dolan at Johns Hopkins, not as part of the psychedelic group there. And there's a period in the life of humans and mice where they're maximally social. It's the teenage years for people, and it's, I don't know exactly what it is. It's day 12 for a mouse or whatever it is. But then it closes and they become very solitary. And she found when she gave them both MDMA and I think LSD as well, that it reopened that window, that developmental window.
I have no doubt.
So I think that it may be one of the things these tools do is allow us to reopen windows that have been closed.
I agree 100%. I have a relationship with what you just said, you know, exploration versus exploitation, because you might argue that the search is exploration, right?
Oh,
it's
yeah,
like
it
exploring these altered states and probing these altered states and consuming the literature and feeding your brain and just going out into the unknown, hurling yourself into the abyss is a form of exploration. But then you could argue that all of my work, this conversation right now, making the videos, bringing the camera along for the ride to record the afterglow, is then the exploitation part. It's like, well, how can I capture this and share it with others? You know? But I think if you have a negotiation with yourself that is in integrity, I think you could live a life that is oriented around regular access to awe
I think we need
and the
both.
sublime, and then bring it back, and then fetch water and chop wood, contend with the unknown, and then bring it back in digestible form.
We're not one thing, and we shouldn't strive to be one thing.
That's right.
And we need these different dimensions.
Right.
And
But yeah. I mean, I just keep thinking that we've gotten so good at mechanized cognition. We've gotten so good at collaborating and cooperating and creating systems and instrumentalist relationships with one another. Like, you're my Uber driver and you're the pilot of the plane and I'm the passenger of the plane. And these relationships that allow society to function, the I-it relationship that Martin Buber talks about.
Yeah.
But then we also need I-thou. You know, encounters with the totality of another person without an instrumentalist agenda, without a transactional agenda.
And with
just
ourselves, too.
Encounter the infinity of ourselves and
this
others.
division of labor we're applying to ourselves. That
That's right.
I'm this kind of person
That's
that does
right.
this kind of thing.
That's right.
And that's not our whole selves.
No.
And we sell ourselves short by...
Yeah, dude. I mean, it's cliche, but it's so true. It's like Dead Poet Society, you know, that speech by Robin Williams where he's like, you know, engineering, science, these are noble pursuits necessary to sustain life, but poetry, love, romance, this is what we stay alive for. And so if these windows, if these encounters, if these like sublime approximations to whatever you want to call the great beyond, these instances of poetic truth, these encounters with awe are so healing. We just need to get better and better, I believe, at like reverse engineering the access. Like, I want to perfect the portals to awe, you know, like the set of best practices. Just like, you know, my buddies Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheel and Stealing Fire have written about what they call the altered states economy, the $10 trillion a year that are spent to get out of our heads, from entertainment to movies to drugs, all these things. And then they're trying to figure out like these advances that are happening now, the four forces of ecstasy: psychology, technology, neurobiology, and pharmacology. And how our increasing understanding of those four is giving us an increasing demystifying sort of scientific approach at being able to enter these states of higher information access, deconstruct them, reverse engineer them, and reproduce them. And like that could be the pathway to healing the mental health crisis, potentially.
Well, it could be. And that in a way is what I'm most interested in, because there's a huge amount of human suffering out there that we could help relieve. and that's why I'm so excited about this research going on, and the fact that these drugs are moving toward approval, both MDMA for trauma and psilocybin for depression and the anxiety of the dying, and a whole bunch of other indications. But the other thing to keep in mind is we're all on a spectrum with the mentally ill, right? I mean, it's not.
Oh yeah, no. I think we're exactly. We're all suffering from micro PTSD, bro.
Trauma is remarkably common. Depression is common. Sure. Anxiety is I mean, there are different degrees of it, and that's one of the reasons I think that this term I use in the book, the betterment of well people, is something we also need to keep in mind.
Well, this is very important.
But we have to. We have to go beyond brain or consciousness hacking. There is also a desire to be very instrumental about this and turn it into another business, another edge. I mean, microdosing is about improving productivity at work for many people.
Oh, the irony.
And so I can easily see this going down that path. And,
sure. Well, that's what's savvy sometimes about capitalism, is that they'll take like genuine, legitimate attempts to break out of the indentured servitude of a broken system, and it's like, I'll sell you the tie-dye shirt.
It can.
I'll sell you $90 yoga pants so you can reach transcendence.
Yeah, no, I mean, capitalism we've learned can co-opt just about anything, and I'm sure it'll figure out a way to co-opt psychedelics.
It makes me laugh so much. I want to read you this quote because one of my things is I'm always. One of my favorite lines by Isaiah Berlin is, to understand is to perceive patterns. And with language, I'm always making connections between things. So I just read you that quote by you where you talk about the desire to escape banality, but also the reality that banality is a energy saver.
Yeah.
So your words.
And there's a lot of profundity in what we consider banal. That the Hallmark card, which makes us want to throw up, nevertheless has a kernel of emotional truth in it.
Well, 100%. But we also can't spend our whole time marveling at the Hallmark card, because then we wouldn't get anything done.
We wouldn't get out of the drugstore.
So yeah, exactly. So your words were, what is a sense of the banality of something, if not a defense against the overwhelming power of that thing experienced freshly? Banality depends on memory, as do irony and abstraction and boredom. 3 other defenses the educated mind deploys against experience so that it can get through the day without being continually exhaustingly astonished. Those are your words. Then I stumbled...
Before I had ever used a psychedelic, by the way.
Had you tried cannabis when you wrote
cannabis,
that? Yes, okay. And then Martha Nussbaum writes something similar, because I was trying to get into, yes, banality...
The Body and Pain? Where did she write this?
I'm not sure, but I'm going to read you the quote, because I was trying to get into the defining characteristics of an awe-like or a state of wonder, like what it feels like, how to describe it from the inside. And I was like, banality and boredom are ways that we shield against being overwhelmed all the time. But when we are overwhelmed, we find ourselves we feel like our eyes are opening for the first time. And so she says, the characteristics of these experiences, of these jolting and awakening experiences, are surprise, vivid particularity, and extreme qualitative intensity. And she says these are all characteristics that are systematically concealed by the workings of habit, which is the primary form of self-deception and self-concealment. And so I was like, that reminds me so much of that line. It's
so
like
I misspoke when I said The Body and Pain. That's Elaine Scarry. But I wonder what Martha Nussbaum book that is. I'd love to know.
Yeah, it was from one of those beautiful articles written by Brain Picker. And she was quoting Martha Nussbaum. But basically the idea is our primary...
Well, habit is the enemy here.
Correct. Because our primary aim, she says, is to comfort ourselves, to assuage pain, and to cover our wounds.
Right.
And so that's the whole thing. We hide behind our habits.
Right.
And but then we become miserable inside those same habits that we hide behind. It's like you have to be able to be self-aware enough to know what habits are useful and advantageous, and which habits are providing a form of hiding from oneself.
And where something that seems very adaptive suddenly lapses into being incredibly destructive and maladaptive.
That's right.
But habits are useful. They're very efficient. They get us through the day.
Yeah.
They help us navigate routine events, but they also dull us to experience. And anything that breaks habits, that's why I think travel is so important too. I mean, you land in a foreign country, and I mean, it's changing now because you can get an Uber just like the way you do
That's
at
right.
home, but it used to be
Yeah.
everything was different. How does this work?
That's
How do
right.
you get a cab? How do you navigate the city? How do you ask for X? And it's exhausting, but it's incredibly stimulating too, because you're having to learn. You have to go back into that explore phase.
That's right.
You're not ready to exploit because you
That's
don't have
right.
enough information.
That's right. That's right. Beautiful. So let me ask you something. The entropic brain theory. Robin Carhart Harris, neuroscientist from Imperial College of London, I believe your friend. Brilliant guy. So this is a very interesting theory, and you touched on this before. It basically says that most of the mental health pathologies that we've like labeled into their own subcategory, like this person's depressed or this person is anxious or this
The
person's
DSM
OCD.
diagnoses.
That it turns out that all of these seem to be characterized by the same thing happening in the brain, which is the default mode network, which is the seat of the autobiographical mind, so to speak, has metastasized and become overactive. So this is where the patterns have become imprisoning.
Yeah.
Right. And that the usefulness of these psychedelic experiences, whether they're evoked by taking a psychedelic or simply an extreme experience that you have,
or meditation,
shake the snow globe.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
But here, okay, so what I'm curious about is that, okay, so this works for the pathologies of a brain that has become too ordered.
Right.
Which is depression, anxiety, OCD, all these things.
Yeah.
Too much order, too much guardedness.
Too much rigidity.
Too much rigidity.
Mental illness is formed around rigid habits of thought. Yeah.
Okay. But that they don't work for illness and mental illnesses on the other spectrum of a brain that's too disordered.
Right.
Because the
schizophrenia, personality disorder, mania.
So this is interesting to me because isn't it possible that somebody with extreme anxiety could become psychotic? I mean, so it's like, couldn't they like be so ordered that eventually the thing gets scrambled and they become completely disordered?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Because there hasn't been enough conversation about that specific thing.
Yeah.
You know, like people who are bipolar can go from depression, which you would be like, psychedelics could help, to manic or schizophrenic-like, where you're like, actually, psychedelics are not going to help this person.
And in fact, with bipolar, they don't use psychedelics. They disqualify people. They cannot participate in the studies.
So if they're depressed because of their bipolarism, they don't qualify.
They screen for. They have a way to screen for people. You present as depressed, but you can ask a few questions and determine whether they have manic phases, even if they're widely dispersed.
Got it. What about hypomania?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Because that's another interesting one that I've always wondered about, because it's, again, these things exist on a spectrum, right? There's the wonderful book, The Hypomanic Edge, which says that a sort of mild form of mania with high executive function is actually attributed to high success.
Sure.
Whether it's like Steve Jobs or all these leaders that if you were analyze them, the way that they connect the dots and their pattern recognition capacities and the spaces of mind they go are almost manic, but not quite. And with a high executive function. So they can kind of steer the fire hose.
Right.
But the fire hose is coming out. It's not steering them.
Right.
And I wonder then, Steve Jobs took LSD and said it was one of the greatest experiences of his life. And he was certainly like potentially hypomanic, not fully manic. So it's I'm interested in this because as this stuff starts getting used more and more in psychotherapeutic context, people exist in spectrums. Yeah. So it's like, you might be like, well, they're not manic, but they exhibit traits of hypomania. Should they still take
they take it or not? And I think it's one of the things that remains to be really learned is who should and who shouldn't take these drugs. I mean, it's important to stress there are risks.
Yeah.
And people do have the occasional psychotic break on psychedelic drugs. Yeah. Whether they were destined to have that break or not is really an open question. Many people who are kind of pre-schizophrenic feel weird and they start self-medicating and they take lots of pot and they take lots of alcohol and they might take psychedelics and any of that can kick them over.
Yeah.
So we should be, hesitant to say we understand all this because we don't.
Well,
the entropic brain theory is a very persuasive theoretical construct that puts a whole set of mental disorders at one end and suggests that the way that psychedelics introduces noise into that system or heat into that system chaos really into that system is exactly what it needs to loosen it up. And that there's a point of criticality between being too rigid and too disordered.
Balance between chaos and order.
And so maybe psychedelics can move us on that spectrum and when we need to be moved.
No doubt.
So I find that a very persuasive theory, but it's just a theoretical construct.
Yeah, and then I also think that we need to bring onto the table the importance of interpretive frameworks as well. It's like, the mystic and the madman are swimming in the same waters, right? But the mystic is surfing and the madman is drowning. I mean, you can go into the whole Joseph Campbell mythological interpretation of this. He says that the schizophrenic is simply in an altered state of consciousness, and he hasn't been, the only way out is through. He hasn't been pulled out in a way that can heal them. And in indigenous cultures,
or he's in a society that doesn't allow.
In indigenous cultures, they might make that person the shaman.
That's right.
Which I think that is very interesting space as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, there's a lot we don't understand about mental illness.
Yeah.
And as a result, our tools for treating it are really shitty. I mean, we really have lousy drugs.
So here's a thought, and I'm curious to your reflections on it. Ernest Becker wrote a book called Denial of Death. Highly recommend. It changed my life. Pulitzer Prize-winning book. There's a line in there, and he might be citing Otto Rank or some of these other guys, but he was basically saying that the totality of the human condition, with our defense mechanisms dissolved, is intolerable. Mortal beings, finite beings who can contemplate the infinite, housed in heart-pumping, breath-gasping, decaying bodies, and that the full awareness of that and the only response to that, he says, is full and open psychosis, and that schizophrenics are suffering.
Or denial.
Correct.
One or the other.
Right. Well, denial through defense, sophisticated, elaborate defense mechanisms and hero systems and culture.
Right.
And that schizophrenics are suffering from the truth was one line that really resonated, because they are unable to form
the defenses.
Correct. The character structures. He uses lines like character is a vital lie, a necessary fiction. The idea of a personality and a culture that is meaningful, and Yuval Harari's notion of the useful fictions,
Right.
And they become true because they govern our actions in the world. And if enough people believes in them and they lead to real action that enacts real change, then
consensus reality.
Yeah, then we live in a consensus. We live in a real virtuality,
right?
The reality of the virtual. But so essentially, Ernest Becker says that ultimately we're all traumatized because of the explicit awareness. Sheldon Solomon, who is a Becker scholar, says the explicit awareness that you're a breathing piece of defecating meat, destined to die and ultimately no more significant than a lizard or a potato. I mean, it's like, whoa, right? Human beings are in quite the predicament. We have the mental capacity to ponder the infinite.
We're going to die, yeah.
But we can ponder the infinite, right? We ponder the infinite, seemingly capable of anything. Yet we're housed in heart-pumping, breath-gasping, decaying bodies. So we're gods and worms at the same time. And that is at the root of our disquiet. That is the worm at the core. That is the thing that wakes us up at 2 a.m. with our heart palpitating. That is the hypochondriasis. That is the anxiety. The brain has become too ordered. The entropic brain theory. But the root of that is that our mentation, right? Our consciousness simply is unable to cope with the reality of our condition. And so to that extent, we're all fucked unless we have interpretive frameworks that can be self-serving enough to cope. What's your Kool-Aid, I wonder your thoughts on that. What reflection do you have about that?
Well, I'd wonder how Becker would feel about psychedelic therapy as something that essentially blows up all those defenses and causes people to confront that and really dwell on death. I mean, one of the things that really strikes me, I think one of the most important things about what's going on with psychedelic assisted psychotherapy right now is that it opens up a new conversation about death that our society badly needs to have. I interviewed for that piece, The Trip Treatment, that you alluded to in the New Yorker, about a dozen people who were had cancer diagnoses, some of them terminal, some not, who were given the drug because of what the doctors call their existential distress. It's exactly what he's talking about, right? I mean, the prospect,
which people feel more when they have a diagnosis.
Absolutely, it's always there.
I've had existential anxiety since I was 15, so it's
but there's
who doesn't have end of life anxiety,
Right, but it gets really acute at a certain point. And when I first heard that, I was like, I wouldn't want to go there. That's not what I'd want to be. I wouldn't want to be taking away my defenses when I'm dealing with this incredibly hard problem. That seems to me anti-Becker. And nevertheless, they had these amazingly positive experiences. In many cases, they underwent a death. A kind of a death rehearsal. It was their ego dissolved, and yet they survived this dissolution of ego and came out of it feeling incredibly hopeful's the wrong word. I mean, but they had the sense that something would persist, that there was a great plane of consciousness or love that they would enter into. Yeah. And it sounds like they were given dreams of immortality, but it wasn't quite that, because sometimes the dream was incredibly naturalistic. So, for example, there was this one woman who had cancer, ovarian cancer, I think, and she went into the soil, and she was traveling through the soil, and she hit against a wall, and she realized it was the wall of her crematorium, and that was her death, and she was that was her fate. But her body was somehow disassembled under the ground, and her molecules were taken up by the plants, and that felt great. That's what should happen. It just seemed perfectly natural to her. Now, that, of course, is a very naturalistic description of what happens after you die. Your body breaks down and your molecules are taken up by the plants.
Yeah.
But she could take a pleasure in that in the way most of us can't, because she had redefined her sense of self.
Well, that's exactly what it is.
And that's the key. Yes. And there's that quote of mine, which you probably know by heart, but I don't, because you seem to remember everything you read. I'm very impressed. By Bertrand Russell. And he was asked when he was quite old, he lived to be quite old, what's the secret? How do you overcome your fear of death? And he said the key to overcoming your fear...
Identify when more things excite from you.
Expand your sense of what your self is. It's not just this bag of bones. It's your community, it's your kin, it could be your nation, it could be all of nature. And the more you can expand that sense of self, I mean, Thoreau did that very well.
All the romantic poets.
The less troublesome the death of your body will be.
So we're ultimately...
So what is the we?
Well, so we're ultimately talking then about the story that you tell yourself about yourself.
Yes.
Fundamentally, our capacity to have an interpretive framework, to craft a narrative that makes life not just bearable, but wonderful. That it's all about the interpretive frameworks.
And the interpretive framework specifically about self.
Expansion. Well, we're talking about the astronaut overview effect.
Yeah.
Astronauts go into orbit, and so what is that? That's an ontological awakening.
And
that's
a
forceful reckoning with, well, they're looking at the planet. I mean, it's like, it's got to be something to be outside of the planet and then see that marble floating in an infinite cosmic ash of nothing is everything we are and everything we've thought, and it's Carl Sagan's pale blue dot.
Yeah.
And that they seem to have this experience that sounds a lot like a mystical experience in that it enlarges the self, or Rich Doyle says you tune in from the broadcast of the ego to the broadcast of the whole. There's another great line, because I love lines. This guy, Tim Doody, wrote an article about psychedelics, and he said that these experiences, they recontextualize the self into a marvelous conduit in a timeless whole from which molecules and meanings flow from neurons to nebula and back again. And so it's like when you have that shift in self-perception, self-expansion, no doubt you're going to lose your fear of death. The only bummer is that when you actually die, you can't ruminate over how deliciously beautiful that language is. So it's like, that's the problem I have with ultimate death, because I'm not yet convinced in cognition surpassing the death of the brain, and I love cognition so much. But that's kind of where I'm at with that conundrum, because I see the poetry in that Tim Doody line. I've had those moments of expansion, and they have dissipated my anxiety and made me feel that I am part of something larger than myself. But then I hear about, a person I know who got cancer, and then it's like existential bummer all over again.
Yep. I'm with you. I'm sorry, I don't have an exit for you.
Well, so we're on the same boat on that one.
I mean, except that one of the things that really struck me about my experiences on psychedelics, which I had fairly later in life than
did.
a lot of people, was that they do in a funny way reconcile you to death in a way that I didn't expect. I mean, I had one of the most ecstatic experiences I had was death obsessed. I mean, I was there were bones and my dead grandfather came back to me, and he looked just like me, and yet something about it meant it all just seemed just right. And then I merged with this very sad piece of music by Bach, this unaccompanied cello.
Did you cry?
Suite, yeah. And it was
That's
so
yummy.
sad and so beautiful at the same time.
Yeah.
And it was, and this was after I had an experience of ego dissolution, and then this merging that follows.
For sure.
And I think that's what the people, the cancer patients were feeling. Something very similar to that.
There are few reveries more intoxicating than aesthetic reveries. I remember watching. Do you know the musical Les Mis?
Yeah.
They had a 25th anniversary concert of it in London that I watched, and they had just a massive stage, like 5 choirs behind the actors, and they're singing like the last song, the crescendo song, like One Day More, and they're all singing it together, and the audience is crying, and you're just like, okay, that is heaven on earth.
And you're doing it together.
If you could do like time dilation and lose yourself in the climax of a song,
Right.
It's like Jamie Wheel talks about the trifecta: ecstasis, catharsis, and communitas. So first the ecstasy, the losing the sense of self and tuning into the larger whole. Then catharsis is the moment of finally like surrendering and having the grief, the fully letting go and realization and communion. And then finally the sense of community and merger with everybody else,
And I think that merging is really important.
It's funny. Yeah. I love those feelings so much. And it's like, I still feel like the vessel for those experiences is my embodiment.
Right.
And so that's why I'm just like wanted to last as much as possible, because I'm a bliss junkie ultimately,
Yeah.
I live for aesthetic arrest. And it sounds from some of the things you've written that you can relate.
I do too.
Yeah, brother. Well, what can I say? It's been such a pleasure. We've been chatting for an hour. I could talk to you forever, but I want to respect your time. I want to say thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jason. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Inspiration, and yeah, I'm glad to have connected and to have met you. Thanks so much, Michael Pollan. Anything you want to point the audience to at the moment, aside from your wonderful books?
I don't think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you
beautiful.
might point people to the book we talked about, Botany of Desire, which many fewer people know about.
Great.
But it is where I began examining these questions and was really struck by the fact. I mean, I came at all this work by my fascination with plants.
Yeah.
And how we are in this very rich symbiotic co-evolutionary relationship.
Yeah.
And they change us and we change them.
That's right.
And we use them for a great many things, but one of them is to change consciousness. And that desire is the one that has obsessed me for quite a long time.
I wanna maybe end with this one beautiful quote, and I believe it's from David Lenson.
Yeah.
And so
You should tell people who he is, because most people don't know who he is.
Totally. David Lenson teaches comparative literature, and
Right.
he wrote a book called
UMass Amherst, I think.
UAM, yes. And he wrote a book called On Drugs, which is about the phenomenology of drug use.
Yeah,
So
which
really
we both agree is like the best book written on drugs.
ever.
Yeah.
And we've been talking about awe and altered states of consciousness and their characteristics, that they seem to take you out of time. They take you from chronos or mechanized cognition to kairos to poetic time. I often use the analogy of like watching a film. So from the outside, total running time, 1 hour and 20 minutes. But from the inside, you can have a profound life experience that occurs outside of time. Right. And both are true. Like I had a real experience that was outside of time. That's true, but it also was only a 2-hour running time.
Right.
There's that Ursula Le Guin line where she says, science describes accurately from the outside, so that's chronos.
Yeah.
Poetry describes accurately from the inside, so that's kairos. Science explicates, but poetry implicates.
Oh, that's nice.
That's so beautiful. So then I'll leave you with this one. What is metamorphosed in repeated drug taking or any kind of altered state of consciousness is time. That's what's metamorphosed. What Einstein did for physics and Nietzsche did for philosophy is recapitulated in every drug-affected mind. Drug consciousness in the 20th century has reflected and even mimicked changes in the way physics and philosophy have reinterpreted the universe. Once a subject is accustomed to constructing consciousness according to this cognitive quantum mechanics, the return to a Newtonian universe is difficult to achieve. Such a reversion, it seems to the user, would require a renunciation of joy and play, of insight and vision, and of privileged knowledge and perception. It would entail a return to mechanized cognition.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Stunning, right?
Yeah. To David Lenson.
It's David Lenson. Thank you, Michael Pollan. You're one of my heroes. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks,
Great
brother.
pleasure.
Cheers.